The Ten Commandments, known as the Decalogue, constitute the 10 foundational moral and religious rules given directly by God to Moses in the Bible in Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5. These directives outline duties toward God and toward other people. The concise sentence formulation identifies them as the 10 foundational moral and religious rules given directly by God to Moses in the Bible, outlining duties to God and to other people. The single-word designation is Decalogue. The short version presents 10 concise statements that serve as the memorable core taught across traditions. These include prohibitions against other gods, graven images, misuse of the divine name, failure to observe the Sabbath, dishonoring parents, murder, adultery, theft, false witness, and coveting. The short version functions as the standard summary employed in religious instruction and cultural references. The long version expands each directive with explanatory clauses drawn from the biblical text itself. The full passage in Exodus details the prohibition on images by specifying likenesses of things in heaven, earth, and water, accompanied by declarations of divine jealousy and generational consequences, while the Sabbath command incorporates creation motifs and rest requirements for all within the household. Deuteronomy reiterates the list with minor adjustments, such as altered rationales for the Sabbath rooted in historical deliverance rather than creation. These textual forms establish the commandments as both succinct ethical boundaries and elaborated covenantal instructions. Descriptions of the 10 Commandments frame them as a set of rules from God that form the core of the Mosaic Law. They operate as direct commands spoken by the divine, establishing obligations for righteous living within the covenant community. As a moral guide, the commandments summarize divine will for human behavior, with the initial directives addressing duties to God and the subsequent ones addressing duties to others. They reveal sin and promote justice within communal settings. The commandments appear predominantly as things to avoid through their prohibitive structure, emphasizing boundaries against idolatry, irreverence, violence, betrayal, and envy. They set limits to prevent harm in relationships, both vertical and horizontal. The commandments relate to a pathway or standard connected to heaven and eternal life by presenting perfect obedience as a measure for entering life. Yet they simultaneously convict of universal moral failure and underscore the necessity of grace and faith. They point toward salvation through recognition of human inadequacy rather than through self-powered rule-keeping. Different traditions interpret their ongoing role variably, yet they remain a cornerstone of biblical ethics that balances divine authority with interpersonal conduct. The 10 Commandments integrate these elements into a unified framework that has shaped moral discourse. Their formulation assumes a theistic context in which divine speech provides both the content and the enforcement mechanism. The short and long versions together supply the textual basis for ongoing analysis, while the descriptive categories clarify their function as rules, guide, prohibitions, and soteriological pointer. This multifaceted character allows the commandments to address exclusive loyalty, reverence, rest, familial order, and basic social ethics. The structure prioritizes divine honor alongside human relations, creating a comprehensive but historically situated moral code. Subsequent examination reveals how these aspects unfold through interpretation, challenge, contradiction, practicality, and broader existential placement. Interpretations of the 10 Commandments. Traditions differ in numbering and emphasis when approaching the 10 Commandments. Protestant and Jewish traditions treat the opening declaration of divine identity as introductory, while Catholic and Lutheran groupings combine the first two prohibitions into a single commandment and divide the coveting directive into separate concerns with neighbor's goods and neighbor's spouse. These variations reflect theological priorities regarding monotheism, iconography, and internal desires. The first commandment receives interpretations centered on exclusive loyalty, with Protestants and Jews viewing it as strict monotheism or undivided allegiance. Catholics incorporate it with the image prohibition. Modern readings sometimes extend it metaphorically to reject any ultimate priority given to wealth, power, or ideology. The second commandment addresses graven images or idols. Protestants, particularly Reformed groups, prohibit religious statues or icons as idolatrous. Catholics and Orthodox distinguish veneration from worship. Jews apply the rule broadly against visual depictions of the divine. The third commandment concerns misuse of the divine name. Traditional views limit it to false oaths or casual cursing, while broader interpretations include manipulative religious language or hypocritical invocation. The fourth commandment requires Sabbath observance. Jews and certain Christian groups maintain literal Saturday rest. Most Christians observe Sunday in commemoration of resurrection, with some viewing the command as fulfilled spiritually rather than ritually. The fifth commandment calls for honoring parents. Interpretations stress literal respect and material support for elders, yet acknowledge higher loyalty to divine when parental demands conflict with ethical standards. The sixth commandment prohibits murder, with the Hebrew term indicating unlawful killing rather than all taking of life. Traditions permit just war, capital punishment, and self-defense, while pacifist perspectives read the rule absolutely. The seventh commandment forbids adultery. Ancient contexts tolerated certain polygamous arrangements, yet later interpretations tighten the standard to include internal lust. Contemporary discussions address divorce and remarriage within shifting cultural norms. The eighth commandment bans theft. Liberation-oriented readings extend the prohibition to systemic economic exploitation. The ninth commandment addresses false witness, initially focused on courtroom testimony but expanded to encompass all deception or gossip. The 10th commandment prohibits coveting. Catholics separate this into distinct concerns with goods and spouse to maintain 10 total directives, while Protestants retain it as a unified internal prohibition. Across all commandments, interpretations balance literal application with contextual adaptation, producing diverse emphases that reflect denominational distinctions and cultural settings. These interpretive frameworks demonstrate the commandments' flexibility within religious communities. Each directive receives elaboration that connects ancient wording to lived theology. The first 4 commandments focus on divine relationship, while the latter 6 govern human interactions. Numbering differences do not alter the substance, but influence catechetical presentation and liturgical use. Interpretations consistently tie the rules to love of God and neighbor as the overarching summary. This dynamic process ensures the commandments remain relevant for moral formation while accommodating variations in practice and emphasis. The result is a living body of guidance that adapts without losing its foundational character. Logical fallacies, paradoxes, and criticisms of the 10 Commandments. The 10 Commandments exhibit several logical fallacies when examined as a moral system. Overall, the structure involves circular reasoning by assuming divine authority without independent proof. A false dilemma presents obedience or immorality as the only options. Appeal to authority underpins the entire list, and the naturalistic fallacy equates divine command with inherent goodness. The commandments commit incomplete enumeration by claiming foundational status while omitting numerous ethical domains. Per commandment, the first begs the question of divine existence. The second incorporates a genetic fallacy and collective punishment through generational guilt. The third relies on equivocation regarding vain usage. The fourth appears arbitrary in its cultural specificity. The fifth risks conflict with superior duties. The sixth equivocates on killing versus murder, given broader biblical endorsements of violence. The seventh remains culturally bound to specific marital norms. The eighth and ninth suffer from vague scope in complex societies. The 10th introduces a thought crime fallacy by punishing unacted desires. Paradoxes emerge throughout the 10 Commandments. A jealous deity demands exclusive worship, while forbidding coveting and idolatry that mirror the condemned human flaws. The prohibition on killing stands alongside divine orders for mass violence in other narratives. Generational punishment conflicts with later assertions of individual responsibility. The commandments claim universality, yet originate in a specific national deliverance. Promises of long life for obedience contrast with the suffering of obedient figures and prosperity of the disobedient. These internal tensions highlight inconsistencies between the rules and the larger narrative framework. Criticisms target the commandments as theocentric rather than humanistic, prioritizing divine honor over human welfare. The list lacks explicit prohibitions on rape, slavery, child abuse, or genocide. Cultural and historical boundedness to ancient patriarchal theocracy limits applicability. The rules promote intolerance through exclusive worship and authoritarian obedience. Modern irrelevance appears in rigid Sabbath observance and thought crime elements that resemble totalitarianism. Overstated importance surfaces when the summary of love for God and neighbor supersedes the detailed list. Additional issues include historical and cultural parallels with earlier Near Eastern codes, debates over public legal displays, theological reinterpretations ranging from literal Old Covenant rules to fulfilled principles and psychological or sociological effects, such as fostered guilt, tribalism, and patriarchal language. A positive legacy persists in shaping Western ethical concepts of dignity and rule of law. The logical, paradoxical, and critical dimensions reveal the commandments as a historically situated code rather than an exhaustive or flawless moral system. Fallacies undermine claims of self-evident authority. Paradoxes expose narrative tensions. Criticisms underscore incompleteness and contextual limitations. These elements collectively demonstrate that the commandments function within a specific theological framework while encountering significant analytical challenges when evaluated on logical or ethical grounds. The analysis maintains focus on the internal structure and implications without external supplementation. Biblical contradictions involving the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments contain self-contradictions within their own biblical presentations. Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5 differ slightly in wording and rationale, particularly in the Sabbath command's justification. Exodus 34 presents an entirely different list explicitly labeled the Ten Commandments, emphasizing rituals, festivals, sacrifices, and dietary rules rather than the ethical set. These variations indicate composite textual development. Contradictions with other biblical passages further complicate the commandments. Generational guilt declared in the Second Commandment stands against statements of individual responsibility in Ezekiel 18 and Deuteronomy 24. The entire Mosaic Law, including the Ten Commandments, receives declaration as obsolete or fulfilled in later writings. Jesus reinterprets several commandments, expanding adultery to encompass lust and declaring the Sabbath made for humanity rather than vice versa. Such reinterpretations alter the original scope and permanence. Contradictions appear in the actions of biblical characters who know the commandments, yet violate them. Immediately after receiving the rules at Sinai, the Israelites construct the golden calf, breaching the first 3 commandments while Moses remains on the mountain. Moses himself smashes the tablets in anger and earlier kills an Egyptian. King David covets, commits adultery, lies, and arranges murder, violating at least 5 commandments, yet retains designation as a man after the divine heart. King Solomon constructs high places for foreign gods and maintains hundreds of wives and concubines, directly opposing the first, second, and 7th commandments. Samson engages in lust and violence that contradict multiple directives. Numerous kings throughout the historical books perform evil despite knowledge of the law. Even the divine commands the slaughter of entire populations, actions that equate with violation of the 6th commandment. These narrative instances demonstrate repeated disobedience by figures fully acquainted with the rules. The pattern of contradiction extends across the biblical corpus. The commandments claim to provide clear moral boundaries, yet the text records consistent human and divine actions that undermine or selectively ignore them. Textual variations, reinterpretations, and character behaviors create an internal tension between ideal prescription and actual depiction. This dynamic illustrates the commandments' role as aspirational standards rather than consistently observed practices within the narrative world. The contradictions underscore the gap between stated law and lived reality in the scriptural account. The practicality and reality of the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments possess limited practicality in daily religious life. In a religious sense, they demand exclusive daily loyalty, ritual rest, and internal purity supported by prayer and community. Conflicts arise when crises tempt reliance on non-divine supports or when modern schedules prevent rigid Sabbath observance. Believers often adapt through grace, yet strict adherence generates isolation or guilt during doubt. The first commandment requires constant rejection of competing priorities, clashing with practical needs for medicine or relationships. The second restricts artistic or symbolic aids to devotion in some traditions while permitting them in others. The third prohibits casual language that functions as cultural norm. The fourth imposes a fixed rest day incompatible with shift work or family demands. The fifth assumes ideal parental dynamics that frequently prove absent or harmful. The sixth allows exceptions for war or justice, while pacifists maintain absolutism. The seventh struggles against human sexuality and cultural shifts in marriage. The eighth confronts survival pressures or systemic inequality. The ninth navigates social lubrication and confidentiality. The 10th targets unacted thoughts that arise naturally. In an agnostic or neutral sense, the commandments become nonsensical when stripped of religious scaffolding. Without divine referent, the first and second lack meaning and conflict with natural plural loyalties or visual communication essential to memory and culture. The third governs non-existent linguistic taboos. The fourth ignores biological and economic variability in rest needs. The fifth enforces honor amid dysfunction or abuse. The sixth requires contextual definitions of killing that evolve with survival demands. The seventh imposes contractual ideals on fluid human relationships. The eighth assumes stable property concepts absent in communal or crisis settings. The ninth demands absolute honesty that ignores protective or strategic necessities. The 10th punishes normal ambition and comparison. Across a human lifespan, the commandments prove incompatible with biological instincts, social complexities, and economic pressures. They assume a static tribal world rather than the variables of birth to death, cultural transitions, or technological change. Daily interactions, emotional realities, and survival choices render rigid adherence impractical in any era or context. The practicality and reality of the Ten Commandments reveal systemic mismatch with lived existence. Religious application relies on faith-based motivation and forgiveness to bridge gaps, yet neutral analysis exposes unenforceability and contextual fragility. The rules prioritize divine honor over adaptable human welfare, creating friction in every domain of personal and collective life. This assessment encompasses the full spectrum of human experience without reliance on supernatural assumptions. Conclusion: interpretations, contradictions, and daily reality. The Ten Commandments align partially with the laws of nature through correspondence to evolved instincts for reciprocity and cooperation. Prohibitions on murder, theft, and false witness reflect natural tendencies toward group survival and tit-for-tat behavior. Honor for parents matches mammalian parental investment. These elements emerge organically in any human society. Contradictions with natural laws predominate in the remaining directives. Exclusive worship and image prohibitions oppose observed religious diversity and symbolic drives. The coveting ban conflicts with ambition that fuels innovation and resource acquisition. The Sabbath rule possesses no basis in circadian rhythms or physical cycles. The commandments prioritize supernatural loyalty over observable biological and ecological realities. An average person unaware of the Ten Commandments follows many directives instinctively through empathy, social norms, and self-interest. The first 4 commandments register as irrelevant in routine work, relationships, and leisure. The latter 6 align with practical avoidance of harm that arises without explicit instruction. This person derives moral guidance from culture, consequences, and innate fairness rather than divine list. The result produces functional, everyday ethics free from additional layers of ritual or thought regulation. Broader incompatibilities separate the 10 Commandments from human existence across biological, psychological, social, economic, cultural, historical, temporal, technological, and existential dimensions. Human bodies and minds operate on instincts for survival and emotion that resist absolutist demands. Mental health realities amplify internal conflicts. Social dynamics require nuance and compromise absent from the binary rules. Economic pressures redefine property and labor in variable environments. Cultural diversity and historical change expose the commandments as parochial. Technological and future contexts introduce scenarios beyond ancient anticipation. A full lifespan involves flux that fixed rules cannot encompass. An unaware existence yields greater happiness through reduced guilt and clearer worldview rooted in evidence and adaptability. The commandments function as one cultural lens that generates unnecessary constraint when imposed as universal moral guidelines. Human flourishing proceeds through flexible, context-sensitive ethics tailored to the realities of existence on Earth.